Welcome to another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. I have a very special guest with me today. I've been trying to get him on the show for quite a while now. How you doing, Troy?
Hey, how are you?
Good, man. Happy to have you. Troy is with the Bitcoin Policy Institute. The way that I see it is that's kind of the lobbying effort for the Bitcoin industry.
I want to disagree with that very strongly.
Okay.
We're not a lobbying organization, and it would be illegal for us to lobby as a 503c.
Gotcha.
Lobbying has a different designation tax-wise, and our mission is actually similar but different. We are an educational organization. Kind of like, well, I'm actually at my college here. I'm actually also a professor of philosophy and humanities. And, that's another educational organization. So is BPI. And it's true, however, that we are, generally speaking, orange-pilled folks. And educating people in Bitcoin seems a lot like, it seems a lot like lobbying from the outside, because the message around Bitcoin is largely, the truth around Bitcoin is largely positive, right? So when you say that, because the mainstream narrative is so skewed, it sounds like you're lobbying. And so I totally get why you made that mistake, but I think it's a very very important distinction to make.
Yeah, so Coin Center plays a similar role. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. There you go.
Okay. The reason I said lobbying is because you guys are the vanguard of responding to a lot of, how do I say this?
You can say FUD.
Yeah, that's great. Simplify it. Love it. Okay. A lot of the FUD coming from the, whatever you want to call them, the bureaucracy, the government. And speaking of FUD, you guys must have had your hands filled the last 2 or 3 months, right? So just to give you guys a couple things I want to talk about. U.S. government sanctioning open source software for the first time, referring to Tornado Cash. Also, the digital assets framework released by the White House. Let's start with the digital assets framework. Did it surprise you that it's not even the administration, I'm not even going to blame it on the Biden administration, but did it surprise you that the administration took such a stance with Bitcoin? And why did they make it so that the regulatory requirements for the entire mining industry are so, like, no other industry is made to adhere to those types of requirements and those types of standards? So from your perspective, why do you think they release something like that?
Yeah. Well, let me step back first and sort of revisit the history of where this all came from. I think the history actually goes way back to Alex DeVries, Digi economist, and used to be Doge economist, a hobbyist Dogecoiner who became a Bitcoin hater, worked for the central bank, is now in graduate school in economics. And basically, he was a hater and published a website devoted to Bitcoin hate, and particularly on the environmental front. And that fed into an academic literature, fed into a famous article in Nature Climate Change in 2018, claiming that Bitcoin mining alone could raise global temperatures 2 degrees over pre-industrial times. And that piece then fed into environmental activism. There was a letter sent to Congress signed by 70 environmental organizations, which cited that paper, which was based on this, garbage hobbyist website. Also, that paper was refuted 3 times in the same journal. It was published in the same year. It's utter fabrication, that paper. But that letter, signed by 70 environmental orgs, led to other congressional letters and a congressional hearing, congressional letters to the EPA, and so on. That led to the White House taking action with, I think, probably smartly, doing a whole of government approach and sort of issuing an executive order to many branches of government to basically frame what the U.S. how the U.S. should respond to a new and emerging industry in terms of its ramifications for, let's say, energy rates and for pollution of various kinds, global warming, for its impact on criminal activity, evading sanctions, etc. Right? So that's the origin of this thing. Maybe it would have happened without Doge economists kicking it off, but I think the actual form it took was really just a few people creating a lot of fear, and then that creating a movement among nonprofits, and that creating a political movement, and that generating a response from government, right? So I think that's the backstory. Can we start there?
No, but I didn't know all those things. I did remember the hearing. It was funny how they called it. They called it the cleaning up cryptocurrency. They had a whole committee on it, just in the name itself. So
exactly,
Troy, I'm I don't I don't work at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, but I'm in this weird kind of position where, to do a good job for Simply, we have to cover the news every single day.
yeah.
And from our perspective, we believe a lot of these people are not stupid. Okay, so going back and referencing the Digiconomist, from my perspective, I believe they're doing it on purpose. I don't believe that they're so naive that they're just completely missing out any updated data. And I think Nick Carter did a fabulous job. And then actually Saylor even said it himself, to quote him. He even called I forget the name of the report, but it was something climate related to cryptocurrencies. Saylor even used very strong wording. He even called it propaganda, right? So
I have a slightly different take. I mean, I have a slightly different take than Nick and then Michael Saylor. So I agree that report, citing Digiconomist in particular, gave him more credit than he is due, for sure. And I think also, even though Mora is cited like once and in passing, that is also ridiculous. And I, in general, appreciated Nick's incredibly thorough and detailed, dismantling of elements of that report. But what I saw in the report was, no, not a propaganda campaign at all. I saw an office in the White House of non-specialists, non-Bitcoiners, trying to deal with like an incredible body of evidence, new evidence on a topic they did not understand. And so they put out a call for request for information. In fact, my partner at BPI, Margot Pez, and I wrote one, and they got a tremendous number of replies, including one that was very influential from the Sierra Club. And what they did was basically read those RFIs, synthesize what they were reading, right, and read the literature cited in those RFIs. And the truth is, there just isn't a good body of literature on Bitcoin and its impacts. It's an incredibly subtle, revolutionary kind of consumer of energy. And they were trying to kind of triangulate and make the best of what they had. So let me call your attention to some of the really good things in the report that basically did not appear anywhere before this report in anything from anyone affiliated with the Democratic Party. One of those things was that they completely debunked and dismissed the evaluation of Bitcoin's power use or emissions per transaction. They completely rejected that metric, which lots of Democratic politicians and haters of Bitcoin have used. They debunked it very well. They also acknowledged Bitcoin's role in mitigating methane, and particularly in landfills, but also in flaring. They also acknowledged that the future of a high penetration renewable grid, a grid that's based a lot on wind, solar, hydro, and so on, will require large, flexible consumers of power. They recognize that Bitcoin, as a user of power, is flexible and can participate in demand response. They acknowledge that it could have a role in financing new renewable build-out. Right? These are things we haven't heard anyone from the left basically say about Bitcoin. Now, they're all qualified. Every time one of these things was mentioned, they would walk it back. They would contextualize it. They would surround it with FUD. I mean, I will grant you that the tone of the document was definitely, this is bad. It's guilty until proven innocent. And it was grossly unfair. And I tweeted a lot about that at the time relative to other industries. But you got to think Overton window. You know, what was acceptable to say about Bitcoin before the report and what was acceptable to say about Bitcoin after the report. And let me just say, too, another thing that they rejected, which I have not seen anyone else on the left reject, is they rejected the equivalence between proof of work and proof of stake. You know, and this is huge because we're up against a campaign right now to quote unquote change the code, which everybody knows the code is not going to be changed. You're not going to convince tens of thousands of people around the world to suddenly change their code, and you're free to introduce and change the code yourself. That's a front, however, for a regulatory attack, a government attack on Bitcoin and proof of work. And this administration did not take that bait. They did not say, oh, well, you know, hey, there was plenty of praise for proof of stake. But when it came to comparing proof of stake and proof of work, they explicitly said, we're not going to do that. We're going to let the market do that and the experts in the field do it, right? And we're not those experts. And finally, I will say in defense of this report, which is odd because I also hated much of it for me to be defending it, but I'm just providing, I think I'm providing the kind of ray of hope that, that Nick and Michael Saylor are not, I think, giving quite its due. This is an opening salvo. The main conclusion of the report was not Bitcoin's bad, let's ban Bitcoin. That was not the conclusion of the report. The conclusion of the report was, we have shit data. We need better data. We actually don't know what the emissions profile of Bitcoin is, what its energy use is, how it interacts with markets. We don't know, and we have to study that. And moreover, there was an invitation to the industry to meet with them and start a dialogue about this. So this was not the end of a conversation, actually, from the administration. It was the beginning. It was an opener. And Costa Samaras, who heads the energy division of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, came on Twitter and did a Spaces, maybe a week after the report came out. And when people asked him about Digiconomist numbers and how they're probably off, he said, look, we were just trying to survey the numbers that were out there to give you a sense of what was there. We're not endorsing those numbers. In fact, our conclusion was that we don't have good numbers and we need them. The purpose of the survey was just to see what's out there and to give you a kind of range. And Digiconomist is part of that range. And even though Digiconomist is not actually, an academic, his numbers get cited by all the academics, actually. They get cited by all the academics. So I agree completely with Nick Carter that, it's embarrassing to cite Digiconomist. It's even more embarrassing to cite Mora et al. 2018. But in context, what they were trying to do is kind of like a lit review. This is a bunch of bureaucrats and scientists, PhDs in various fields, economists, energy experts, environmental experts. They don't know anything about Bitcoin. They basically self-educated on an entire field, wrote this report, triangulated what they had, and then I think there's this little sentence that triggered everybody about how, if Bitcoin mining, crypto mining cannot show itself to be on a path to carbon neutrality along with the rest of the economy, then we could have executive action or legislative action. And that was the kind of like stick behind the report. But it was an incredibly, that was basically like, you need to come and talk to us. There's no actual plan to do that. They would have a really hard time in pulling it off. So I actually saw the report as a good thing. I think these kinds of like civil servants are not malicious. They are probably heavily influenced by, they're the groups that are more allied with them. Like the Sierra Club is going to carry a lot more weight with them than BPI, for instance, because they're a political supporter, right? So that kind of colors the report. It's not perfectly objective or anything like that. But I think we did really, really well given my baseline expectations. I've never, all those positive things I listed, I've never seen any of those before from a Democratic politician.
So you mentioned, and that's very interesting because I'm picking that pattern up, and to me, it's extremely troubling. Right, Bitcoin is a neutral technology. It doesn't favor the political left or the political right, but the pattern that I'm starting to pick up, and it troubles me tremendously because the last thing that I want for Bitcoin to be in the United States is become a partisan issue. Why more hostility coming from the political left than the political right? The political right seem to be a lot more embracing of this technology versus, not all, okay? We know that Senator Gillibrand is teaming up with Senator Lummis in the crypto bill, right? I hate using that word, but that's what it is. But you also have examples like Elizabeth Warren that is literally out to get the industry. She's on a she's she has her target set. Why do you believe that is, Troy? And more importantly, right, because we could all complain and whatever, what would it take for that to change?
Well, it's an unfolding tragedy from my perspective. I think we're seeing polarization. It's happening in Europe on this issue as well. And like you say, there are exceptions. Ron Wyden was one of the people who pushed back against some of the original attempts to crack down on Bitcoin by Treasury, and he's a Democratic senator from Oregon, where I'm at right now. And there are a few voices on the left, and but as you say, it is spiraling, and it's just hard not to believe that this issue gets polarized like every other issue. But it is also, I think, a tragedy because I think of Bitcoin as a neutral technology. It does hamper the sort of fevered dreams of control and money that some people on the left have. And I think the cheap answer to your question of like, why is it polarizing, is that some on the left have authoritarian leanings around issues of energy use and climate. They have authoritarian leanings around control of money. And the left is growingly comfortable with authoritarianism. And that didn't used to be the case, but I do see elements of that, right? I hate to admit this. That's, I think, the right-wing Bitcoiner says it's because the left is authoritarian. I'm still in the camp of the left doesn't understand the potential of Bitcoin for achieving all of the aims that they want to achieve. Like anything that the left wants, basically Bitcoin can help us get there faster. They don't see that yet, and they're really, really put off by the political identification with Bitcoin from the other side. So when Ted Cruz is like talking about how Elizabeth Warren doesn't get Bitcoin and she just wants to control you, so the left sees that and they're like, well, Ted Cruz likes it, it must be bad. And Ted Cruz is making fun of us because of that. And then the Sierra Club gives them a nice report showing how Bitcoin's destroying the environment. And they're like, okay, yeah, that's it. We're done with Bitcoin. And that's how the actual thing goes. They're primed to hate it because their enemies like it. And then we don't need an explanation for polarization because, it's just everywhere. And what we're trying to do, and maybe this is stupid, I don't know, but what I'm trying to do still is to explain Bitcoin's benefits in a neutral way, to explain its potential in a neutral way. I mean, I think that access to a financial system and rails and access to a savings vehicle that is non-debasable, access to uncensorable peer-to-peer payments, I think that's good for everybody in the world, no matter your political leanings, unless you're an autocrat. Like if you trying to spy on people and control them, maybe Bitcoin's not good for you. But otherwise, it can be good for you. So that's the hope. That's the tragedy. Watching this spin out of control, and also the hope. I've actually read a fundraising letter from Jared Huffman about Bitcoin. It's like, we wrote a letter to the EPA fighting these Bitcoiners. They're destroying the environment. Right? And once you start to see fundraising letters that are written on the issue of Bitcoin, it's like, oh my God, this is going to be really hard to get back under control.
Oh man. And yeah, I've picked up on that too, unfortunately. And the tragedy of this, right, is, this solves the inclusivity issue. It solves a lot of people, which, by the way, I fundamentally agree with. They're working 2 jobs in the US and they can't make ends meet. And the tragedy of it is they think it's the other political party, and that both political parties do this great bait and switch. If you give us power, the Democrats will fix your problems. If you give us power, the Republicans will fix your problems. But the issue is the money's broken, the money's stealing from everybody, and it's causing this crazy wealth inequality, which just throws more gas on the fire. And I think that Bitcoin is this common ground between people with differentiating ideologies, and it's unfortunate.
It's amazing to look at an issue like inequality, which used to be at the very center of the platform for Democrats. Like, we face a massively sort of accelerating income inequality, wealth inequality, unaffordable housing, and you have people on the left. And as you say, my diagnosis is just the same as yours. It starts in 1971. There are many causes of inequality, but a big one is our monetary system accelerates it. And this is not some secret, but just when you think about how money works, it gets redistributed upwards. Essentially, money redistributes wealth upwards, and we destroy the value of labor over time. So it's bizarre. It's bizarre to me that we have people like Elizabeth Warren essentially fighting the one thing that can fix the problems that they care about. And, she's a big bank. I mean, she came to power on her critique of banks following 2008 crisis, right? Elizabeth Warren was a leading critic of banks and bank regulation. And now she is in their pocket defending them against an upstart competitor. The banks are exclusionary. The banks accelerate inequality. And the one thing that disintermediates them with just a few lines of code is Bitcoin, and she's trying to attack it, right? So it's just like, to me, yeah, either she is a rank hypocrite and thoroughly corrupted by Washington, or she is tragically misguided. One of those two.
I took and I fought myself very hard to buy into the this is malicious, and I fought myself hard, and I because you're looking at this and you're like, look. And then the example of Norway came up, and the Norway example was really interesting because, once again, I don't know why this is, but it was the left-wing parties in Norway that wanted to ban Bitcoin mining. Now, what's interesting about Norway is that 98% of energy production in Norway comes from renewable energies, of which 100% of Bitcoin miners in Norway are powered by renewable energies. And for some reason, they still wanted to ban it. And that, to me, was very troubling. And where I'm at in my mind, and it's not necessarily the truth, or I'm just telling you the conclusion that I've reached covering this day to day, being a slave to the news cycle, is maybe it was never about inequality to people like Elizabeth Warren. Maybe it's always been about power. And what we know about Bitcoin is it completely disintermediates power, right? And, one of the central tenets, right, is having a central bank. You're having a central bank, you control people through monetary policy. Perhaps it's a fundamental threat. And to me, Troy, that is the heartbreaking part, because I guess maybe I've convinced myself that it was always a noble goal, but perhaps, like Bitcoin always does, it exposes incentives. And as the case with Elizabeth Warren, we have an example of that. Bitcoin exposing incentives like it always does. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is, I guess, it's a trope, but it's a good one, that the real resistance point to Bitcoin is control, giving up control, control of the money supply and control of who pays what to whom. And you do see Elizabeth Warren going after that. You do see her going after that when she had the chain analytics guy on, like grilling him about the ability to trace money from billionaires. Right? That's a concern coming from Treasury, but then she also has the ESG FUD, and I guess probably the right way to think about it is that the environmental arguments against Bitcoin, while they may be sincere, are the easier arguments to make because they don't look like a naked power grab in the way that the OFAC arguments go, the Treasury arguments go, like, because Treasury doesn't really want to say straight out that we want a financial panopticon where we can see every single transaction in the world, cancel it if we so choose, or reverse it, right? Because that sounds really, really creepy. But it sounds okay to say, sounds more than okay to say, we don't want some new consumer of power coming in and keeping coal plants open that we're closing down and polluting the atmosphere in their neighborhoods and increasing the CO2 and undoing our efforts elsewhere in climate. So we've got a nice sounding attack and a kind of nasty sounding attack, and so you put out the nice one first, and that's like your front line. But you always have the real motivation of just a naked power grab behind it. In terms of Norway is a very long country, north to south. And it's what's interesting is not only are all of the miners in Norway running on renewable energy, but also the miners in Norway are all in the north. And the north doesn't have sufficient interconnection to the south. Power is very expensive in the south. The resistance to mining Bitcoin, some of it was coming from like, hey, our power is really expensive. We're in an energy crisis, and these are, using large amounts of energy, wastefully, quote unquote, just to get more Bitcoin. But actually, mining in Norway is exclusively in the north, where power is cheap because there aren't large consumers of power, right? So the issue is kind of complicated there, and yeah, it's the Greens driving things. I think what has happened is that we are in a moral panic, right? We're in a moral panic. There isn't a logical explanation for this. I'm writing like these policy pieces and going after arguments one by one, sort of Nick Carter-esque. You treat them like points in a debate. You just examine each point. Is it true? Is it false? What's its evidence? What are the arguments against it? But what's actually happening is that, in part because of the money, we're in a kind of social collapse, and everyone can feel it. Everyone can feel that politically things are uncertain. Economically things are uncertain. And we're doing what humans have always done. We're looking for a scapegoat. We're looking for a simple explanation, right? Is it illegal immigrants? What is it? Like, politicians live on creating these simplistic narratives that explain everything about why the world is falling apart. And here's a narrative. Bitcoin is to blame for basically everything. It embodies every single thing wrong with the world. It's a hyper financialized digital tool that enables gambling, theft, and destroys the environment. On top of it, enables us to basically disintermediate the state, undoes all of the good that collectively humans have ever done to live peacefully together. Bitcoin destroys and attacks all of it while enriching a few Bitcoin bros and sending us beyond any climate target. That is an explanation of everything. It's the ultimate bad guy. It's the ultimate villain, right? So it's what's so funny is you step into the Bitcoin world, and we also have an ultimate villain, which is fiat and the money printer, right? It's like Yeah, it's also a somewhat simplistic explanation. But once you're caught in this, I mean, what's amazing to me, I'm sure you've seen this as well, is the Bitcoin haters on Twitter, right? These people like devote their lives to hating Bitcoin. They're on Twitter writing all the time, and it's all negative stuff, right? They think they're fighting. This isn't about arguments. This is like some kind of spiritual warfare, right? This is a moral fight for the soul of humanity in the future. And Bitcoin is like a symbol. At this point, it's a symbol. It just represents a certain kind of individualistic disregard for institutions and other people and the environment and, climate justice, etc. Disregard for all of the sacred cows. And so that's what we're up against. And that picture just so happens to align to back to your political polarization point. I guess I'm answering my earlier question. That bad guy image plays perfectly into the left's image of a bad guy, right? So it's just perfect bait for them. And we have to somehow get beyond the moral panic. How do you get through a moral panic? I mean, usually you go and hide. Moral panics are not good places to be out there fighting. That's where people, you know what I mean? That's where like witches get burned and people get, end up drinking hemlock or whatever. You don't want to be a rational person in the middle of a panic. You want to be on the right side of the panic, the winning side with power, right? But that's the kind of dark picture of where it goes. The brighter picture is that it looks kind of like the internet. Like there was kind of a moral panic to begin with, or electricity, or other disruptive technologies, radio, trains, automobiles, every cool thing we have, there was a moral panic of some scale around it. And that, 20 years in the future, Bitcoin is so boring, no one can understand why you ever spent a few years of your life, talking about Bitcoin. It's just like the electricity running through your walls. No one's like, I'm an electricity guy. I mean, we have electricians, but they're not people who like advocate for electricity. I like to educate people about electricity. No, it's just like we all use it. It's part of our lives. Same with the internet, same with the telephone, same with the train, right? Maybe that's the future for Bitcoin. The question is, how big does the moral panic get? And how long does it take us to get to that point? You look at a moral panic around marijuana, that lasted decades. The moral panic around like satanic rituals or whatever, that was maybe much shorter lived, maybe 10 years. So if I really wanted to know what the timeline is, I'd be looking at like the history of moral panics.
And it's fascinating because I remember that propaganda piece where they're trying to scare the crap out of people from using electricity. And it's like a propaganda piece from like the early 1900s. And it's like people are just getting electrocuted. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And look, the Bitcoin haters are fascinating. They have some type of Stockholm syndrome because it's like, what are you really fighting for? That stuff ain't benefiting you. What are you doing? But I think that they're so entrenched in their position. Now, I kind of wanted to pivot a little bit. You mentioned the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the OFAC. And for anyone that doesn't know, and Troy, please correct me if I'm wrong, they are part of the U.S. Treasury, and they're the ones that sanction other countries, right? Now, what was really interesting, though, is that not too long ago, suspiciously, a couple weeks before the White House released their digital assets framework, of which they referenced what I'm going to talk about, they sanctioned open source software for the first time. And Matt Odell had this amazing tweet, and it was fascinating. He's like, look, a blog post, and the US government successfully shut down a mixer. Now, what's interesting, though, is that the Office of Foreign Asset Control also set their targets on Russia and Iran. And in the news recently, Russia and Iran have both announced that they're going to use Bitcoin to facilitate international trade. The U.S. government gets a tremendous amount of power, has a tremendous amount of power by being the world reserve currency and being able to police people by being the world reserve currency. Bitcoin is being used currently, even though it's in very small levels, to circumvent a lot of US sanctioned policy. How is the Treasury ever going to accept something that diminishes its power?
Yeah. Well, just to go back to Tornado Cash for a minute, I was at a conference recently at MIT, and regulators were there and talking about that sanction, and they were like insistent that the protocol was not being sanctioned, that that's just what it sounded like. But if you understood what they were actually trying to do, it was like sanctioning people. And uh, more generally, this is an issue with Bitcoin and other truly decentralized things. Regulators do not understand like how to deal with a protocol. They understand how to deal with an organization, a state, a person, a business. But it's always like there's a face, there's always a leadership, right? And with Tornado Cash, it's like who's the face, who's the leader, and so they kind of fumbled, they kind of stumbled. But the same is true actually of Bitcoin. If you think about who represents Bitcoin, there was an instance, and I wasn't there personally, but I heard about it, where a U.S. senator actually asked, like, who is the CEO of Bitcoin? Like, they wanted to talk to the person, right? And if you think about it, the people who lawmakers do talk to about Bitcoin are miners, head CEOs of mining companies, and also exchanges and other Bitcoin businesses. But those people are not Bitcoin. Right? If anybody's Bitcoin, it's us. It's the plebs, right? But it's a collective social thing. It's like a it's like a mycelium or a forest or something. Bitcoin, and so they don't really know how to target that. Now, when it comes to OFAC and your question about evading sanctions, yes, I think this is a concern. Yeah, right now criminals use cash. That's the biggest way to evade sanctions. That's the biggest way to launder money. That's the way to facilitate crime. After that, probably USBC, or HSBC, and the other large banks that have been convicted of money laundering more times than you can count. But Bitcoin can enable us, and that's a fear they have. And so the question is, what happens next? And I think we look at what happened with OFAC and with Ethereum. Ethereum's kind of the upshot for Ethereum. And we can predict what will happen with Bitcoin if there's a very large transaction, or if it just becomes a norm to evade sanctions with Bitcoin on a large enough scale that it really bothers Treasury. I don't think they will give up power. I think they will sanction it just the way they sanctioned, Venezuelan currency or whatever. They could do that. I think the most immediate pain point for our industry would be the miners. They could make it illegal to include certain addresses, transactions from certain addresses in a block. And they could just, as an executive order, say to all miners in the country, in the US, or for their allies too in Europe, like, don't include any transaction in a block from such and such addresses. And if you do, there will be penalties that you do not want to face. And people will comply with that, because what choice do they have, right? The question is, okay, right now, US has maybe 30% of the hash rate. So that's not 51%. So they can't control the chain. So blocks will still get mined that include the forbidden transactions, and they will still be added to the Bitcoin blockchain. And now we face a really serious choice point from OFAC. Are they going to say you cannot mine on top of a chain that includes a forbidden transaction, but you have to kind of like go back in the chain before that forbidden transaction appears and mine from that, block stump? Are they going to say you have to do that? Because if they say that, essentially they've made it illegal to mine Bitcoin in the US. right? And if they just say you can't include these transactions in a block, that's fine. You just don't have access to the revenue from certain transactions, but they still get mined. They still get included in the Bitcoin blockchain, and Bitcoin is still an uncensorable payment network. If they say you can't mine on top of any block that includes a forbidden transaction, that's essentially a ban on Bitcoin mining. You can mine some other coin that's kind of like Bitcoin, but it will not have 51% of the hash rate, right? So that's the big, if I'm sitting in treasury, that's the discussion I'm having right now. I recently haven't finished this book called Treasury's War by Juan Zarate, where he details how Treasury developed these sanctioning tools. And like they're really happy about what they're doing. They're very proud of themselves for waging war, literal war, but in a nonviolent way, just through controlling the flows of capital. And Bitcoin, if it represents a threat to that, they are hugely motivated to sanction it. The question is, do they really want to kill off mining in the U.S. when we have 30% of the hash rate? It's a deeply ingrained business in the US, and it would be politically disastrous to basically make Bitcoin mining illegal. Also, it would be challenged in the courts. I don't see it going very well in Texas when they tell the Texas miners to like stop mining Bitcoin when they have built businesses around that. Right. So the political ramifications would be huge. The legal situation would be dicey. And then if they fail in their attempt, if OFAC goes after Bitcoin mining in America, it says you cannot mine on top of a block on a block that on top of a chain that includes a forbidden transaction, essentially outlawing Bitcoin mining in the U.S. If they did that and failed because they lose in the courts and they get stomped politically, and Bitcoin comes back, then Bitcoin is even more robust because the most powerful force on the planet, the Treasury Department in money, the Treasury Department of the United States government, could not stop Bitcoin when they tried. And then it's moon time.
And it's actually interesting because you've been thinking about the game theory as much as I have, right? And yeah, it's such a predicament that they are in that, in my opinion, I think that was part of the motivation behind setting a precedent, not sanctioning an individual, not sanctioning a government, but sanctioning a software, right? Because they're saying, hey, if we can get away with this, right? And honestly, it was a strategic move, but it was and it was very well thought out. And I'm going to give them credit for that, right? Where they released the blog post, and it actually eventually, fast forward, it led to now we know that more than 50% of the Ethereum validators are actively censoring for the Office of Foreign Asset Control. They have a different beast with dealing with Bitcoin because of its decentralized nature. But still, are you seeing what I'm seeing? There is going to be an inevitable full steam clash between this bureaucracy that believes that they fundamentally get to choose who is entitled to use money or not, and Bitcoin's open monetary network. And I think it's inevitable, and it's going to be a hardcore crash. I see it. It's on the horizon. But
I mean, I would just say, I think you're right that the mindset in Treasury is incompatible with what Bitcoiners envision for Bitcoin's future. Bitcoiners envision an unstoppable, censorship-resistant, peer-to-peer payment network, and the Treasury cannot allow that to happen at scale. Yeah, the other things Bitcoiners want is they want it to be big. So if Bitcoin at, let's say $500,000 a coin and huge capital flows, suddenly, even if the dollar is unthreatened in its status as world reserve currency, you now have a very viable alternative to the dollar through much of the world, which undermines Treasury's ability to control all capital flows. all major capital flows. So you're right. There's an incompatibility in those visions, and something's got to give. But what I guess my hopeful note here is that Treasury made this move kind of in the dark. They didn't ask the public's permission, like, hey, how do you feel about us controlling all money? That never came to a vote. That was never on a ballot. No candidate ever ran on that issue. It was more like a series of convenient maneuvers in literal wars. Right? We're trying to get governments to cooperate with us, and this was a lever that Treasury discovered that they could use, or multiple levers that Treasury discovered they could use. So it really was a bureaucratic fantasy. It's like, oh my God, we don't have to pass any legislation. Nobody does have to run us. We have more power than we realized. All we have to do is just like issue these executive orders. And because the dollar is the world reserve currency, and because we have a lot of transparency in terms of record keeping, we've already enforced that across the banking industry. We actually have a ton of power. Like, let's use it for good. The tone of this book, Treasury's War, it's really triumphalist. It's really self-congratulatory. And I'm sure there's a lot of cleverness and genius in applying this. But me as a Bitcoiner reading it, I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's like you're proud of basically stealing power from people. That's how I see it. So those visions will clash, but I think that Bitcoin will bring Treasury's dream into the public sphere, where it will be debated, because it does have upsides and downsides. Like, we do lose something when we give up that level of control. We lose something in terms of our foreign policy. But then there's this tremendous gain in terms of human freedom, and we'll have to have that public discourse, and I think that's a good thing.
I 100% agree. I think it's going to, and not only that, right? Not only is it capital controls, but it's also a very important question that I think politicians are especially the some people call it the deep state. I would rather call it the administrative state, because it's right up in your grill. Why are we being forced to use a money through legal tender laws that is designed to go down in value, that is designed to lose purchasing power? And I think that is going to be a very, very difficult question that they're going to have to answer, right? We know that a lot of the specifically in the United States, what's the deficit spending, like 1.5, some absurd number, trillion? They can only get away with that with the money printer, right? So it's these very important questions that we're all going to have to answer. But you, my friend, and I told this the moment that David told me that he was going to start BPI. I said, my friend, good luck. You're going to need it. You're going into the cobra nest. That is the swamp of Washington, D.C. So and a lot of these answers, perhaps they know, and this goes back to what I was asking you in the beginning, Troy. And I'm going to tie this in with a report that the White House released, and it was called The Future of Money, and it was released by the Treasury. Shout out Janet Yellen. In the Future of Money report, they did not mention Bitcoin one time. They mentioned stable coins, and they mentioned payment systems, and of course, our best friend, central bank digital currencies. But they did not mention Bitcoin, which tells you where the administrative state sees the future of money in their eyes. And they're seeing it from a position, I'm going to borrow what Lawrence Lepard said when he came on the show. They want to hold on to that privilege of being able to create money for free that everybody else has to work for. So even if you are armed with the facts, which you guys do an incredible job at BPI, maybe it's falling on deaf ears. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. we've got two powers. The one is the power to demand that taxes be paid in fiat currency. And I don't see why states are ever going to give that up, even if Bitcoin succeeds wildly. And don't see the U.S. giving that up anytime soon. But also, everything is cheaper for Americans because of U.S. reserve currency status. Why would we give that up? Well, it has a downside as well. It makes our exports more expensive. Triffin dilemma, trilemma, etc. Right? So it's there are downsides to having that status, but it gives us a tremendous amount of control. It gives us power. Right now you see our status is saving us in a way because everyone is everyone's selling treasuries, but their currencies are all depreciating against the dollar. Right, so it's like, why would you give that up? Why would anybody give that up? Would I give it up if I were there? Probably not. It's a lever of power. Why would you give it up willingly? I mean, the great thing about Bitcoin is we just build this stuff in a parallel system. You don't have to. We're not forcing anybody into it, right? And you can opt out at any time. And even if like Treasury cracks down in the worst possible scenario and they outlaw mining in the US, they're not going to be able to stop me from running my node. They're not going to be able to stop peer-to-peer transactions. It would be political suicide to do so, to even try it, right? And even if they passed something like that, it'd be challenged across the union. So these like bureaucrats would love to maintain what they've got. In fact, keep enhancing it. That's what all bureaucracies do, what all organizations do. They never cede themselves to a new system, right? They never cede power. They always consolidate power and build. I can't think of any examples of certainly any organization, bureaucracy I've been a part of or known. That seems to be their whole goal. But Bitcoin doesn't really require them to do anything other than, it doesn't really require them to do anything except spin their wheels. In a way, the best thing they could do to stop Bitcoin is just give us really good functioning money. Don't spy on us, don't censor our payments, don't print tons of money, and you do see tightening. Dropping the price of Bitcoin pretty dramatically. It's like, okay, if the Fed's going to tighten, then that makes an inflation hedge less valuable. So in a way, the bureaucracy, the only way it can really stop Bitcoin is by crushing demand for it. And while there might be some measures that hurt demand from where it is now, to truly put it under, they would have to just make money really good and be very trustworthy, right? Which is another kind of great scenario. If states all of a sudden kind of like step up, run a money supply, responsibly, don't spy on people, don't censor transactions, like that's a pretty good world. If Bitcoin languishes at a very low price because of that, I'm just fine.
Yeah, no, and it's all the game theories playing out. It's fascinating, but we do know that it's going to culminate into something. And what's really interesting about what you're saying, Troy, is, yeah, it'd be great if they didn't debate the currency and if they didn't censor currency, but they're not going to be able to resist that temptation to debase.
No one ever is.
And to control, right?
I kind of like to think about, maybe it's because I am, contrarian, like yourself. I'm thinking there is a kind of collision course here somewhere down the line. If we don't avoid that collision course by getting lots and lots of adoption of Bitcoin and building political capital,
yes,
then Bitcoin gets kind of banned, pushed under, or whatever. It's just going to continue. You can't eliminate it, right? You can't stop Bitcoin. And then when it recovers, again, it's something I said earlier in the show, when Bitcoin recovers from the U.S. government going after it, you have re-election cycles, right? There are going to be people who are pissed, absolutely pissed, if we ban Bitcoin. Imagine the most severe ban. Imagine the whiplash effect from the next election cycle. Okay, then Bitcoin comes back. And then it's just like, yeah, even the U.S. government couldn't kill it. And then that's kind of like the final boss in the video game, and it's game over.
100%. And you know what's actually really fascinating is the halving falls on the day, the year of the U.S. presidential election. Now, whether you think that's a coincidence or not, I don't know. That's up to you to decide. But another thing, Troy, and I want to take advantage of the last 10, 15 minutes that we have together. You said something about the necessary political capital that needs to be accumulated. I'm a big believer in that, and that's what I believe is going. That's actually a big theory of my case, right? Is that in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see these very important questions that we just were talking about just now. Why am I being forced to use the money that steals from me or that's designed to lose value? And why is the treasury dictating who can use money and who cannot use money? Right? How do we start that grassroots movement? How do we bring these ideas to mainstream consciousness? Because the reality is, if you are not living in Argentina or Venezuela, where you have to adopt Bitcoin out of necessity rather than out of speculative reasons, how do we bring those ideas to mainstream consciousness, specifically in countries, and I'm going to borrow Alex Gladstein's words, that have the financial privilege of having relatively stable fiat currencies that don't steal from you quite enough for you to really kind of care about? How does that happen? Is it just a regular grassroots door to door, campaign issue? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not much of an evangelist. You might think otherwise on Twitter, but I don't really try to sell people on Bitcoin. When we had NGU, it was good times and you didn't have to sell anything. People always asking you about it. But I do think in the public sphere, we raise the two issues that you raised are excellent. Like, why do we have to use a money that loses value? I think of this in Jeff Booth style terms. Like, why aren't things getting cheaper, given that they're cheaper to produce? Everything's getting cheaper to produce. That's what technology is. Why aren't things actually getting cheaper? Why don't we get to enjoy the fruits of our own labor? Why are our earnings debased as a matter of course? Right? Those are pretty good questions. And then I think on censorship and surveillance, they're good questions to ask about money too. I think of Bitcoin very, very broadly, beyond just thinking of it as good money. It's a tool, and it is a brand new tool in the history of humanity. We've never had a truly decentralized record of the past and a digitally scarce asset before, and one that is tied to the physical world via consumption of energy. So when we think about, is this a good thing? Should you adopt it? Should we make a space for it in our policy? My perspective is we still don't have a really good answer to that question, because the higher order effects of Bitcoin are hard to grasp because we are so early in its evolution, actually. It's kind of like asking in the early days of the internet, what comes out of the internet, right? It's a tool for unlocking human potential and coordinating social human activity in ways that humans could not coordinate before. Kind of like a communication tool. Most broadly, we need to be, I guess, highlighting stories of how Bitcoin is unlocking human potential. I think about, and people don't connect to those general abstract questions that you're asking, even though they're great questions. People connect to stories. And so I think about the stories that Alex Gladstein is telling, Roya Mahboob's story of leaving Afghanistan, of paying her workers in Bitcoin, of girls getting education and having financial independence because of that. I think about Luda's story of funding, flak jackets and first aid kits in the early days of the Ukraine invasion. I think about the stories of preserving one's wealth in Venezuela or Lebanon, the stories of refugees fleeing with money in a 12-word seed phrase. I think about remittances. I think about the circular economies that we're building in, Bitcoin Beach and in Guatemala and in the Philippines and in South Africa. This is how we build political mindshare, thinking broadly of Bitcoin as a tool for unlocking human potential, and then stories of how it is doing that with actual people. And the most recent story that I'm involved with is using Bitcoin mining to mitigate methane emissions on landfills. Like, I didn't anticipate that. I mean, I was into Bitcoin in 2011. I never thought once about possibly mining Bitcoin on landfill gas and what that might do to mitigate global warming. But it's a real narrative. It's awesome. Bitcoin miners fill a niche there that no other consumer of energy fills, and it addresses what the UN calls, or it activates the most powerful lever we have in the fight against climate change. That's an amazing story, and there are many, many more like it. The grid stabilization and demand response participation and incentivizing renewables. These are also stories that I didn't see over a decade ago. And I'm just looking ahead into the future, and I know there will be even more stories just like that. And when I think about a policy environment, do you really want to set up your state with policy that protects a bureaucracy rather than enabling an emerging technology that could address fundamental matters of human concern and expand human potential, right? I think that's my sort of biggest frame.
Beautiful, beautiful, man. I really enjoyed that. And it's a perfect segue to my last question. In your Twitter bio, it says that you're an environmentalist. Now, if you consume the mainstream FUD, you're like, Bitcoin environmentalist? That's impossible. What's going on there? And just to kind of give you, and I know that you're going to enjoy this, I had someone on my show. This is a company called GeoBit Mine, and they're using the excess heat from ASIC miners to warm greenhouses, and that's freaking beautiful. On top of the methane, and I know there's companies using methane from cow things.
Yep.
Things, the cow flatulence, to say it correctly, to potentially turn that into Bitcoin, where before it would go to waste. So just to end it with that, Troy, what is a Bitcoiner who is also an environmentalist?
Yeah, well, I was an environmentalist before I was a Bitcoiner. And in fact, it was my environmental concern about Bitcoin mining's potential emissions that led me to stop mining back in 2011 when I did sort of back of the envelope math. I mean, saying I'm an environmentalist, I'm not like gluing myself to walls and throwing mashed potatoes on paintings kind of activist. I have led discussions of like our investments here at the college, among the faculty, but also I've given my money to these orgs, the same orgs that signed that horrible letter to Congress. I try to live my life in a way that I guess I just think of it as a low time preference, right? I want the world to be better when I leave it than when I came. And that's how you hike, and that's how you live from my perspective. Especially when it costs very little to do so. Bitcoin, I think, is its compatibility with environmentalism is striking and surprising. And you should see my DMs. People will just write me DMs just to say how much I suck for having those two words in my bio. And I get those DMs from environmentalists like, how dare you? This is disgusting. You're such a phony. I'll get it from environmentalists. I get it from Bitcoiners as well. I get a lot of hate from Bitcoiners as well, right? Like, it's shocking. That's why it's in the bio, because the two are actually both true and they both work together. You mentioned, mining, using the waste heat from mining. One way to think about a miner is just uh, it's a heater that does some processing along the way. We already heat with simple resistance, and that's what Bitcoin mining is. So if you have an environmental objection to Bitcoin, you should also have an environmental objection to heating. And as you say, that here's one of those places where we're going to see kinds of creative uses of waste heat that we haven't seen yet. Mm-hmm. We've seen heat used for central heating, for, as you say, greenhouses. We've seen it used for food processing, for fermentation, for like beer or whiskey. We've seen it used for drying timber. Right? There's a lot of uses for waste heat. Soon we're going to see some that are really going to blow your mind with I can read these comments and that is hilarious. I'm sorry. Some of the uses with water are going to blow your mind in what's still coming, right? But it's the main thing that Bitcoin, where Bitcoin works together hand in hand with environmentalism, is actually, this is a point that Jeff Booth makes, and it's related to a point that Saifedean makes. It's that Bitcoin is limited in supply, algorithmically limited in supply, right? So it's a scarce money. And that means that there's only so much debt that you can build on top of that system when you have an option to save that is not speculative, and it's not, and you don't have to spend, but you can just save your money and grow it at the rate of economic growth. And if you look at our world right now and why so much environmental destruction is happening, there's a lot of explanations for it. But here's one pretty good explanation of a lot of the environmental destruction we have. We buy a bunch of shit that we don't need. It's junk, and we regret it. We get sucked into a purchasing cycle that's unnecessary. And another part is that we invest money that spins up businesses that really shouldn't exist. And Bitcoin fixes both of those problems, right? If you can save, you don't have to spend when your currency is inflating. You don't have to spend your money right now. You can save. And in order to save, you don't have to gamble on the stock market. And that money, that extra money that's pushed into the stock market simply because you don't have a savings vehicle, that is malinvestment. It's not adding value. That's businesses failing that shouldn't even exist. And each one of those businesses is extractive, energy using, consumptive. And then furthermore, workers are paid in fiat currency, which is always debasing. And we know wages are sticky. That's kind of how the whole, twofold mandate of the Fed works. Wages are sticky. So in a downturn, no one wants to take a wage cut, but they'll take a nominal wage remaining the same, where they're take a real wage cut. So that works in reverse too. When it allows basically workers to get paid less than they otherwise would, especially when we have a growing economy. So what we have is like wage slaves who are not partaking in the productivity gains, over the last 50 years that they should have. And then they're forced to, with the money that they do have, they're forced to either consume it right away or gamble it on stocks or something, or real estate. Then we push up housing prices because it's another store of value. Then you have to work extra hard to buy a house. So the fact that your wages are depressed and that the goods are more expensive forces you to do work that you really wouldn't otherwise do. So we have a bunch of people who are in, bullshit jobs, doing work that they don't want to do for companies that shouldn't exist, right? And all of this creates environmental destruction. Oof. And then it's just so depressing as a way of life generally. The treadmill, here's where I'm with the left. This kind of capitalism that we have right now is just depressing. Yeah. And that is incredibly destructive to the environment, all of that, right? So that's the biggest picture beyond like, oh, Bitcoin's energy use can be good for mitigating methane. It can accelerate the growth of renewables. We can use waste heat, blah, blah, blah. There's that stuff in particular, and I like all that. But the really big picture is that we have a completely fucked up relation with nature due to our money. And we're living in a dystopia. And part of that dystopia is an environmental dystopia, actually. And if we fix the money, okay, maybe it doesn't fix everything. Humans have always been dicks, but maybe it helps to ameliorate that completely messed up situation.
Man, that was absolutely beautiful. And I fundamentally agree. I think that, and I do agree with the left in that sense too, that people are working 2 jobs and they still can't make ends meet, and that's not right. And, unfortunately, the traditional political means to effectuate change have been corrupted by broken money as well. You really have to change the root problem in order to effectuate change. And it's what you said, right? All the inefficiencies, they're caused by that money printer, right? All the suffering as well. But that's a beautiful way of looking at it. I really like that perspective. And I never really thought about it either. Anyways, Troy, this has been an absolute pleasure, man. Thank you so much for joining us. Where could people
really
find out more about you and BPI and what you're working on?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. This is good conversation. The comments are really distracting to me, but they're also hilarious. I love it. You can find me at Twitter. I'm kind of living on Twitter. I'm trying to wean myself off from it, but it's impossible. It's impossible because there's so many brilliant people there, and there are also just traps for the mind there that I cannot avoid, right? But there's a lot of signal too. I'm at the Tro Crow, and I'm a frequent Twitterer. And that's probably the best place to find me. I'm going to drop a bunch of stuff in the near future for BPI. I'm working on a few different pieces. But you can see my piece I wrote for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy summarizes my take pretty well. I wrote that together with Margot Pez, who's also great. On if you want to follow her on Twitter as well. I can't remember her handle exactly, but it's Jin Urso. The two of us are kind of the BPI energy team.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, that was another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. We'll catch you tomorrow, 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the standard show. Anyways, Troy, I'm going to roll this out. The outro should be like 10-15 seconds. I'll be right back.